Hello? Let's try and finish thoughts on Colossus, the Price of America's Empire. So this is chapter 7, and I think we can actually deal with it rather quickly. It starts by saying, there is a plausible role for the European Union as the partner of an American empire. The peacekeeper that follows in the wake of the peacemaker. That encapsulates the entire idea of this chapter in one sentence. Which basically is that, look, the US is rather good at going to places and blowing them up. The US does not want to stick around. The EU, on the other hand, has a long history of being places for a very long time. The modern EU does not have a wonderful army, does not want to engage in overseas visits, does not want to start wars necessarily, would rather enlarge itself bit by bit, would rather push European values, would rather find, at least ideologically, a peace in the world. You know, one of the reasons that the members of the EU don't fight each other is not all of them have an army, you know, because their militaries are integrated partially, because they're all hiding under the American nuclear umbrella and so on. You have Britain and France, but they also aren't going to be starting any wars anytime soon, right? Their empires have shrunk. So what this author envisions is the US goes in, blows the place up, and then what happens afterward? The US is apparently not very interested in staying for 2 or 3 or 4 decades, helping to prop up a pseudo-puppet government, transitioning a place into democracy. The US is fine with, I want to say, investments, is fine with money, is fine with loans, is fine with sending food and things like that. The US does not want to send its people over. You're not going to have hundreds of thousands of American troops the U.S. is paying for. The U.S. is not going to send an overseer. They'll just send somebody to advise you. They'll take a phone call. Maybe they can give you some really good terms on a loan. The U.S. has its place in moving a country towards democracy and friendliness and peace, but the U.S. is just as dangerous in that way, too, because oftentimes the way it moves a country toward democracy and peace is by bombing it into peace, which in a way works, but has the unfortunate side effect of inducing chaos in the country you just bombed. It has the remarkable effect of creating a very weak government that you now have to spend money to prop up. And so, what's the answer? The US could not do any of this. The US could simply stay home. But then you will have other powers rushing in to fill the gap. And this is the great worry of the United States. If we just leave the Middle East, someone else will come in. And all of a sudden, the Soviet Union will be there, Russia will be there, China will be there, right? Iran will be there. Hey, the entire thing could dissolve into blood and terror. You might have 4 countries popping up with nuclear weapons. The oil supply might be cut off, and so on and so on. And America just wants, like, just stop fighting each other and trade. You know, it's a smaller place again, the world, as I said. And it's not so easy to be isolationist. Yet, what's the answer? You have an unstable place. You have some place run by a dictator. You have some place where civil rights are violated. You have some place where underground markets go through. You have some place where gold is smuggled or people are enslaved. And what do you do about it? Do you leave it alone? Do you let it happen? Do you let someone else take advantage of it? What do you do? This is the conundrum of the United States. The EU has apparently no great issue with letting alone. EU makes a lot of noise. It's like the UN. Lots of noise, not a whole bunch of action changing things. It's just like, if you want to work with us, we'll work with you. If you don't want to work with us, we just won't work with you. And the EU stays home for the most part, doesn't engage in a whole lot of military adventures, doesn't have 140 or whatever bases in all these countries. Yet the UN, the EU, the European Union, is also a place with more population than the United States, more old-timey connections, more history, more information, more practice, more patience, I would think. A culture of long-term thinking, more compared to the US at least. Right? And this chapter goes in on that. So what this person, the author, wants to happen is the United States goes in, blows someplace up, and then somebody has to watch over that place and make sure that it doesn't dissolve into chaos. Well, that's something that the EU can do, is the way he imagines it. He's not going to think that the UN can do it. UN is too scattered. And we can make an argument that NATO could do it. But again, NATO is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What business do they really have in the Middle East? EU, on the other hand, is the European Union. And they can have, they have at least ideas here, right? Like half the problems of Africa or the Middle East can be, or Asia for that matter, can be blamed on European colonization. Maybe it's incumbent upon the Europeans to help fix that problem, help fix some of the issues that they caused in the first place by splitting up tribes, by making lines on a map, by propping up old governments which still have an effect today. So the EU at least has some claim to action. So what the author envisions is the EU coming in, right? The author envisions the EU acting as a counterpoint to the United States. The author envisions the EU integrating more, right? Becoming more like a federalized government. This grand story, this idea, did not happen. Integration of the European Union has stalled. It's beginning to pick up speed again, with the need for a defense against Russia, with the need for dealing with COVID, with the recognition that a unified economic center is useful. But it's a slow burning process. The EU is not quite the United States of Europe. It's just a bunch of states. And we have seen squabbles within the EU quite regularly. Even just over something like Ukraine, which I think would be cut and dried, you have arguments back and forth on either side. Years later, and we're not even sure what's the optimum outcome to look for. I think the French president said something about sending troops, and there was a giant outcry. You look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and they're going, "Oh my gosh, Russia's at our doorstep." You look at Hungary and Germany, and they're going, "Well, we would like to not freeze during the winter." There's lots of stories going back and forth over here. The United States, is safe on the other side of the world, rather distanced from all the effects of Eurasia, whereas the EU is very, very close to things like the migrant crisis. I mean, we think in the United States that we have a problem with illegal migrants, and this is nothing compared to the EU. Why? Because people can walk to us from South America through Mexico. It's a long, long journey, and we have one border wall, and they tend to be concentrated in the southern states, and people integrate because we already have a large Spanish-speaking population. We have a history of immigration, and so on and so on. I was in Europe, I want to say like 5-6 years ago. Wait, no, it's just 2025. I was in Europe like 10 years ago. Ugh, time passing. Jeez. I think I was in Rome, yeah, in Rome. And one thing that I really noticed is the number of African migrants. Like you walked in the streets and it was obvious. Like every single person I saw in certain blocks of the city was African, spoke with an African accent. You saw people, peddling little trinkets on the side of the road, around the Colosseum and whatnot, and like you can notice when every person, 5, 6, 7 people come up to you and they're all speaking with English with an African accent. You're like, okay, they know I'm American. Apparently, they can pick that out. And I'm going, okay, you don't sound Italian. You sound like you're from Nairobi or something. And I noticed in France and in Germany as well, a little bit in Turkey, right? Because you can walk to Europe from most of Africa. You can walk to Europe from the Middle East. All the Syrian refugees, where are they going? They're going to Turkey. They're going to Europe. And I would talk to people and they'd say, well, what you want to do is go to Germany, because Germany, at least at the time, was relatively welcoming, needed workers for its industrial capacity to continue to grow, gave support. Apparently this is due to a vision by Angela Merkel. At least partially, she was the one who publicly explained the idea that Germany was going to be very welcoming, that Germany would set an example, right? And today you can look at the rise of more right-wing politics in Europe, partially as a result of the migrant growth. If you look at, I want to say, Brexit, then one of the major talking points around Brexit was that Britain would be able to control its immigration. Of course, this was total wacko thought. Britain, compared to mainland Europe, had an extremely low level of immigration. But it was enough. Turns out you don't need a whole lot of people. I mean, look at the United States. Turns out you don't need a whole lot of people coming through for the population to have the understanding, the idea that illegal immigration or immigration of any sort is a huge, gigantic problem. All right. And how would you solve the immigrant crisis? Well, the answer, of course, is very simple. You solve the problem of why these people are leaving their own countries. Right? You can set up border fences. You can stick them all in Turkey. You can send them back in planes. You're just going to move a few people. You can move a few lines and that. You can spend a whole bunch of money, right? If you have, 3 million Syrian refugees, they came from someplace. They came from Syria. Why aren't they in Syria anymore? Because it's exploding in civil war. So you can either spend 5 years worrying about all the Syrian refugees, spending billions of euros dealing with them and helping them and fixing the problem, build fences and face gigantic issues in your internal politics, or you invade Syria and you control Syria and you make sure that life improves in Syria. That's the sticking point, right? Making sure that life improves, making sure that Syrians run Syria to the extent that you can trust them to not screw up Syria, right? I mean, Bashar al-Assad was known for bombing his own people. That's not someone who seems very capable of making life better for their own country. No, it's the action of a dictator, of someone who exists because of his family, who's someone who is favorable towards certain tribes or people, right? And you want Syria, you'd think, okay, Syria can fix this by itself, and it can in a way, but it's going to be a civil war, a very long civil war. And it turns out that maybe the dictator is supported by like Russia, and they're going to have a different view on this. Maybe the US supports one of the dictators because they have a favorable business relationship. And now all of a sudden you have a struggle where outside powers are interfering. And then should the EU interfere in that case? You're just making things worse. And we always have to worry about World War III. When you look at, I want to say, the West and the Soviet Union, part of the problem was that neither force was really willing to go in and make big movements because they would be countered by the other side. Because we fought in North Korea and both sides realized we don't want to do this, right? It's very costly, very expensive, very difficult, and you might lose. Don't want to go through World War III, so it's proxy wars on the periphery, right? It's sending Chinese soldiers into Vietnam eventually after the fighting gets bad enough. It's the U.S. slowly ratcheting up the pressure in Vietnam, or the U.S. supporting the Shah of Iran, or the U.S. pumping guns and money into Afghanistan, right? Or it's Russia paying for the Soviet Union paying for the Aswan Dam, or sending Wagner mercenaries into the Sahel region, and so on and so on and so on. And the battle goes. So part of the issue, of course, that this idea the book has is that it's very simple. It sounds rather simple. U.S. is good at going in and blowing things up. So U.S. go in, blow up whoever the bad person is, and then somebody needs to take care of this. Well, it turns out the EU has a lot of people, a lot of money, and it's the rich West world. So instead of focusing on itself, maybe it should focus on some of the other places and assist. Right, like is Iraq exploding? Well, maybe a bunch of EU money and a bunch of EU support and some EU peacekeepers would help Iraq instead of the U.S. being involved in all these drone strikes for the next 15 years. Of course, how much of that is actually the case? I'm speaking as if the U.S. was doing it all alone, but so often the U.S. does not, as this book made note of in the last chapter. You had, when you invaded Iraq, you had a coalition of the willing, right? You have the Five Eyes organization that shares intelligence. You have agreements with what is it? Australia to build nuclear submarines now. You have cross training with British Special Forces. Things like this. You interact with the UN, you interact with the International Monetary Fund, which is mostly European and American money, and so on and so on. The US does not act alone nearly so often as we think it do. I think it does. And it's very easy to criticize, but I do wonder how often the criticization I hear of a country by other countries is real and how much of it is for the domestic market, right? Like you might like the France or the US might criticize Israel, but what are the actual practical actions you make? Who knows? The China might criticize Taiwan, but what are the practical actions you take, and so on? Sometimes there are real things, right? I think China cut off imports or exports. It was something with Australia a few years ago. Like stopped buying a whole category of goods from Australia, and it caused a big problem. Today it's soybeans, American soybeans that China refuses to buy. And these are real practical actions. They aren't just sounds and voices. But I do remember another book I read a long time ago was saying that, countries still have to communicate their intentions. So if you are the government of a large country, you have to communicate to the people under you. You have to communicate to your populace, to the hundreds of thousands of government workers, which way the government is headed, what the intentions are, what we should end up doing, right? Because it's very difficult to rule by fiat. Very difficult to say, here, I'm giving you orders and orders and orders and orders and orders and orders and orders to cover every single possible situation. That causes gum up, that causes issues, that causes a wait and see what my bosses say before I act sort of society. Yet if, the Communist Party is sending out messages that are critical of the U.S. Well, I guess we're anti-U.S. today. Or the U.S. is sending out messages that are critical of China. Well, I guess we're anti-China today. You know, the president of France says something about electronic car dumping. And that sends a message to China, hey, we're willing to bring this into the public sphere. You know, especially if you have like working committees that involves very small numbers of people, but you want to get large numbers of people to move. So how do you make them do that? It's a matter of communication. Right. And okay, so like the vision of the EU is as a counterweight. This does not end up happening. The EU acts somewhat as a counterweight in the sphere of, I want to say, like laws and rules, right? A lot of standardization happens because the EU passes a law or rule about it, but the EU is not a exact counterweight economically or militarily to either the United States or China. And China has really risen to become the other possible side. Now, it hasn't happened yet because China hasn't quite reached the global stage that the US is at militarily, but it is very, very, very close to it economically. Which, of course, creates all other problems. If you have two nearly equal states, both vying for influence over an area, then this continues the conflict. This ratchets up how likely each side is to continue acting and interfering. Because it's like any fight, right? If I end up getting angry and wanting to fight some guy, he says something mean or insults me, so I get all fired up. I turn around and he's like got 100 pounds and 6 inches on me. I'm gonna calm down real fast, you know, because I'm not winning this fight. Like, is punching this guy one time worth the beating I'm gonna get, or am I gonna speak to him with my words, right? But if I turn around and it's someone like me, hey, oh, he's 120 pounds, 5'6", I can do this, right? Then you may, like, you get into a fight and you think, okay, I could win this, just a little more, just a little more, just a little more, and I could win this, you know, just a little more, and he'll back off. I think I see weakness in his eyes. Whereas if I facing a bodybuilder, I go, I don't see weakness in his eyes. That's pity. And then if, you know, some elementary schooler wants to fight me, I'm looking down and going, I don't feel right kicking this 8-year-old in the face. Okay, so let me try and deal with this temper tantrum peacefully with my words. You know, maybe you end up putting him in a, like, you end up picking him up, being like, okay, stop trying to punch me. I have control of your arms. It's not working. You know, when there's a power disparity, fights tend to end faster. Except that's not always entirely true, right? Because you have, well, it's localized, I suppose. Like the terrorists or even the Viet Cong against the United States is a very large power mismatch, but not in the localized area. Like, you're in Afghanistan and the Taliban is the local population. They blend in. They know who everybody is. They're related to folks. They can wander into the hills. They don't need all these fancy equipments. Whereas the U.S. soldiers are very, very obviously U.S. soldiers. They don't know the lay of the land. They have to have a translator to communicate. They don't understand all the history. They aren't related to anybody, and so on and so on. So, yeah, you can bomb the Taliban for days and days and days, win firefights. It doesn't mean you can beat them on their home ground over the course of 15 years. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, right? So maybe that's not always clear. But that's a home ground advantage. If the U.S. wants to deal with like the Taliban trying to exert influence in Bangladesh, probably a little easier to deal with because both parties are strangers there. But the U.S. has links to India, right? Yeah, links to the neighbors, has great ability to bring power into focus overseas anywhere as opposed to among the Taliban. And it becomes slightly interesting. But you also have the inner problem, right, of clear interference, right? By interfering in a foreign country, you might turn that foreign country against you. By putting the Shah of Iran into power, you end up making all of Iran go, maybe the Americans, they want to control us. They want to colonize us, right? Maybe you support a dictator because he's friendly for you, and the entire country realizes, oh, the U.S. is just lying through their teeth, and they say they want democracy for Vietnam, and so on, right? If the U.S. is helping the Colombian army, does that mean that the people of Colombia now recognize the U.S. as an ally of the army who may be full of corruption? Or are they saying that, oh, the U.S. is just an ally as regards the drug war and is pushing to reduce corruption in the Colombian army? And I don't know anything about the Colombian army. I'm just using it because it doesn't have the greatest reputation, at least a few years ago from what I remember, being a place where a lot of cocaine was grown and rather dangerous to visit. I don't know how much of that has changed from now. Yeah, so then it goes into one of the problems that like the EU has in the modern day, that is a leisure preference. Europeans just don't work as long as the Americans. Europeans have a comfier social system and so on. European governments also run on massive levels of debt, which is going to be a problem sooner rather than later, but I get into that enough when I talk about the taxes. The EU also has a lot of protectionism going on. Like, I know that, at least the story was, that French farmers had a lot of protectionism going on, right? Lots of subsidies, you couldn't compete with them, and so on. You know, every country in Europe has its own ideas about how to stay safe, and how do you organize everybody in the EU into a economic policy where you give everybody a voice, and that means it's a very fractured, slow to act voice. Eventually, the EU will probably become much more like a federal government, but it was originally thought this would have taken a few decades. It's going to be more like 100 years, is what it appears to be like now. You know, you have the issue of Brexit, you have political differences over how to deal with Russian aggression. You have the back and forth between, you know, the South spends all the money, the North has all the money, and now it's kind of starting to reverse. The South is doing good economically, the North is doing bad economically. You have the stalled integration of the Balkans, the stalled integration of Turkey, the ongoing issue of Ukraine, and the ongoing change of U.S. military disengagement, and so on and so on. Like, outside pressure will force the EU to change. It's not internal pressure. Internal pressure will drive the EU apart. So the EU, in order to stand together, needs an enemy, I think. And it has plenty of those. But they're all very subtle enemies. Right? Europe is beginning to have economic problems. Europe has high taxes, and so on and so on. Basically, it just means that quite inefficient is the EU as compared to both the United States and China in almost every manner. Okay. So that's basically chapter 7. It says, the conclusion of this chapter is straightforward. The United States has nothing much to fear from either the widening or the deepening of the EU, not least because the two processes stand in contradiction to each other. Talk of a federal Europe emerging as a counterweight to the United States is based on a complete misrating of developments. The EU is populous but senescent. Its economy is large but sluggish. Its productivity is not bad, but vitiated by excessive leisure. It is a successful but insufficiently liberal customs union. It contains a monetary union that is depressed rather than enhance its members' economic growth. It is a legal union, but too much of its law emanates from an unelected and unaccountable commission for it to enjoy legitimacy. And as a political entity, it seems likely to remain confederal for the foreseeable future. Right? And it raises a question, who needs a counterweight anyway? In the final analysis, both the United States and the European Union have far more to gain from cooperation than from competition. Bottom line is that they need, even depend on each other. Very nearly a quarter of EU exports go to the United States, while a fifth of EU imports come from there. The United States accounted for 65% of foreign direct investment into the EU in 1999. The same proportion of European foreign direct investment was in the United States. A substantial share of the U.S. government debt, as well as the debts of American corporations, are held in the portfolios of European investors and institutions. Basically, the EU and the U.S. have all the money. They have a lot of the military. They have a very substantial amount of the population. They have wonderful positions and connections. What they do not yet have is a clear and consistent foreign policy that both of them follow. It's not clear. They don't act in concert enough. They act sometimes, and when they do, it turns out for the better, I would think. But when they don't, it turns out for the worse, because you end up fighting each other. And what happens when you fight each other? You create a power vacuum. You create struggles. You create battles among the periphery. You create unclear incentives for growth or investment. You create the opportunity for someone to speak up and say, I know how to fix this, just give me more power. And that's sort of the story of this entire book, right? That if you're going to act decisively. Even if it's the wrong action, it's better to act decisively than it is to do half-hearted activities that never come to a conclusion. If the U.S. is going to go in and get out, then go in and get out and let the place burn behind you. If the U.S. is going to go in and support democracy, then spend the next 20 years supporting that democracy. Going in and announcing, we'll leave when we're kind of ready, but not an exact timetable. It leads to unclarity. Even today, the weakening of the US and NATO alliance is extremely troublesome to someone like me who studies international affairs at least a little. Because if that breaks apart, the US stands alone, and we're just weaker for that. Okay. Chapter 8. The Closing Door. It starts to go into China and says, China's fate in the 20th century was a miserable one. As I think anyone in China, or looks at China for more than about 5 minutes in history, knows. Okay. The Europeans brought economic transformation to the Chinese periphery, but only in a few cities, notably Hong Kong, did they introduce the full array of legal and administrative institutions they had brought to the post-Mughal Empire in India. China would be a huge free trade zone, but one that would retain its own political institutions, the decrepit remnants of the Qing or Manchu Empire. The transition from empire to republic in 1911 was abortive because of the disastrous consequences of Japanese imperialism and the ensuing civil war. Victory went to Marxist Mao Zedong, who successfully mobilized the impoverished peasantry only to plunge Chinese society into the worst man-made famine in history, and the government-inspired social disruptions, a cultural revolution. Communist China continued to function as a successful empire, but its economic weakness placed serious limitations on Chinese power. Right, and China used to be the exact opposite of this. For most of its modern history, China has been home to between a quarter and a third of the world's population. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, China was also the titan of the world economy. Between 1500 and 1820, its share of world output was never less than a fifth, and may have risen as high as a third in 1820. Yet the 19th and 20th centuries saw a disastrous collapse of living standards in China. GDP fell by a quarter, 1820-1950. 1973, Chinese income per head was worse than most parts of Africa. China's share of world output, which had been close to 33% in 1820, fell below 5%. Why this happens is a hotly debated question. It's partially what the negative effects of Western imperialism. And another issue is China's long-term political unity in the Qing and Manchu empires. Another one is the disruptions in the culture brought about by the Communist Revolution. By the end of the early modern period, the Yangtze Valley had faced ecological crises associated with deforestation. China did not industrialize. China was taken advantage of. China had to deal with Japan invading them. And then China had to deal with its own internal issues, and so on and so on. But since the reforms initiated in the late 1970s by Deng Xiaoping, however, China has experienced a startling economic recovery. In the past 20 years, the average annual growth rate of real Chinese GDP has been between 8 and 12%. According to a study by Goldman Sachs, the Chinese economy could overtake the American economy in size by 2041. It seems that could happen quite a bit sooner. In narrowly economic terms, at least, it seems a more plausible candidate for the role of counterweight to the United States than the European Union. The Great Divergence, it seems, is giving way to a Great Reconvergence, which will see China regain its rightful place in the world system. Right? But this must be treated with caution. Today, just as was true a century ago, there's an open door between America and China, but could that door close? And remember, this book is written in 2004. So it's already quite clear that China could rise. He thinks that the EU is a better, more likely counterweight. This doesn't happen. Instead, it is China that becomes the counterweight to the United States. China is still a very limited counterweight in that it is not a military counterweight in any real sense of the term. Okay. Yes, China has nukes, China has missiles, China has their army, China could invade Taiwan, but China is not capable of interfering everywhere in the planet within a couple of hours. China does not have dozens and dozens of military allies. China does not have a reason even to attempt to take over the world. Right? China is still growing. China wants its sphere of influence, but it will stop at a sphere of influence if a World War III happens. It's not going to become the next superpower. At least not yet. I think that China is going to have to deal with its aging population, and we don't really see what China is going to become until China faces the aging population issue and shrinking population issue and shrinking economy issue that the US and Europe are facing right now. China is still growing, but it's growing slower. China is producing a lot, but it has still weak domestic consumption. China's technology is improving, but it's not quite at the cutting edge of everything. And so on and so on. China's political influence is large, but its cultural influence compared to the US is still rather small worldwide, and so on and so on. One of the other counterpoints, though, is the EU has very clear reasons for working with the US. They're much the same economic situation. They have a long history. They are militarily close to each other. They, for the most part, speak the same language. They have a mutual foe in the Russian Empire. And it's unlikely that like Russia's focus very clearly is on Europe. And maybe parts of the Middle East and Africa. But it's mostly on Europe. And this has really ever been Russia's action, Russia's point of view. It doesn't pay a lot of attention to the East. And when it does, it doesn't always turn out well. A lot the Russo-Japanese War, for example. Or the weakness of its Eastern Fleet. The fact that there are many other countries involved along all the periphery of Russia. How does it get out? How does it have influence? What has to go through the Middle East, essentially? It still has problems with warm water ports. It still has an anemic economy. It still has issues with large empty areas in Siberia and in the East. It still has internal problems as well as issues with terrorism, as we read a few weeks ago. Whereas China is much less needy as regards outside connection. Right? If China isolated itself today, it would be weak eventually, but it would take some time. If the US isolated itself today, it would fall behind the rest of the world completely in 10 years. Due to the different population sizes, due to the differences in geography, the differences in connection, differences in how our economic systems and financial systems are set up. So yeah, the China acts as a counterweight. It's still a little unclear, I think, what China wants as a counterweight. China, I think, would like a multipolar world where it has a sphere of influence in Asia and it can do, as it has historically done, boss everybody else around. But the world's smaller now. You can't just put the Xiongnu or the Mongols behind a wall, because that wall is easily gotten through because you're trying to sell stuff to them. Right? You can put military bases in the South China Sea, and that makes you very unfriendly towards all the other small nations. Sure, you don't care about Vietnam or the Philippines, but do you care about Vietnam and the Philippines and Japan and Australia and Malaysia and Indonesia and India all at once? Right? China is wanting to rise, but not rise so as to make enemies. It wants to rise with a gentle pressure, I would think. Which is kind of the opposite of what the Americans do, right? And what he points out with the closing door argument here is basically the book is about American empire. What is the closing door? There are two closing doors. One is that the world is beginning to renormalize itself, right? The state of the planet where the U.S. is the sole superpower is a historical oddity. Okay? The U.S. became the sole superpower because it had nukes, because the production capability of Europe had been utterly obliterated, because there was an explosion of technology that the U.S. was able to take advantage of. The greatest research universities on the face of the planet for the last 50 years have been American. This is slowly changing. China is beginning to creep up that creep up that line, I would say. There seems to be more international cooperation and so on. Lots of very rich, very happy, very smart people emigrated to the United States. The United States basically received all the scientific accomplishments of Germany after World War II. The U.S. was in the position to unify half the planet around its own activities in response to the Soviet Union. The U.S. became the world reserve currency. The U.S. had all the money. And this is beginning to change. Why? Because the U.S. is only about 350 million people. Because the U.S. is a very powerful seafaring nation, but the U.S., even though it has a bunch of money, has also been running a massive deficit for generations now. And this is eventually going to cause a problem. It's already causing a fiscal problem. The U.S. is very good at going overseas and getting into tiffs and fights, not so good at staying, which means that as the great counterweight of the Soviet Union disappears, as terrorism becomes more of a localized issue, the need for other states to rally around the U.S. becomes weaker and weaker. As the U.S. begins to ask, why are we defending the world when we're getting poorer, its connections with the rest of the world begin to fade. As China begins to rise, is the U.S. going to be a friend to China? Are they going to work together, or are they going to work in opposite directions? Is the U.S. going to work with the EU, or are they going to work in opposite directions? Will they be able to form a unified goal or idea? Or will the U.S. elect somebody and then leave its economic links with other people behind? That is, part of the problem is that, the U.S., it doesn't have, 60% of all the industrial production in the world anymore, because other people built industries. The U.S. still has a ton of money, but also has rising income disparity in its own area, which is going to eventually lead to internal political problems. The U.S. has a giant army, but it's running a deficit. The U.S. is pushing for opening up world trade, for certain ideas to happen. The U.S. has the GPS system, and rockets and AI, but China is there catching up. Other countries are making GPS systems of their own. And most importantly, the U.S. is becoming less interested in world hegemony and more interested, I think, in short-term political wins. Right? The idea of this book, right, in 2004 is, look, the U.S. is going to go into the Middle East. We're going to Afghanistan, Iraq, we can induce a whole sea change in democracy in this area. We can make a lot of links. We can tap down on terrorism. We can make all these countries become more powerful and stable. And to an extent, some of that has been achieved, but it took a very long time. And certain terrorist activities have never been defeated. And we still have the issue of Israel, for example, and Iran. And we still have issues of our own allies fighting each other in proxy wars a la Sudan. And India we still have issues between India and Pakistan, for example, South Korea and Japan. We still have Taiwan as a flashpoint. The EU has dealt with a lot of its migrant problems, but we have a rising right wing, which is more combatant militarily, economically, socially. All right, look at the U.S. interfering in Venezuela right now, possibly preparing to invade, and all the problems that could cause. This shifting focus. So what will the world look like in 10 or 15 or 30 years? Well, compared to this book, the world is going to look a little less safe. Going to look a little more confused. It's going to look undirected. We still don't know really what the answers are, except that China is pretty clearly a counterweight and not a counterparty to a lot of U.S. activity. The book's going to claim, why should the expenditure of up to $100 billion on security and reconstruction not suffice to bring about an Iraqi recovery? The Iraqi war was cheap, but by 1999, 2 decades of war, state control, state theft, and sanctions had reduced the average Iraqi's income to 0.75% of the average American's. 20 years are not long enough to eradicate the collective memory of how a market economy works. Under the right circumstances, Iraq could bounce back quite rapidly. But that doesn't mean that it will be quite as good as we think it will be. Quite as strong or directed. Will it be an ally, or will it just be a country that has a complicated colonial past with something like the U.S.? Nor should we forget Iraq's existing foreign debts, 120 to foreign lenders, plus 125 billion in reparations claims. Talks about oil, and one of the issues of oil is that it goes through pipelines, and these pipelines can be bombed because it's one line that's going through the middle of the desert half the time. Very easy target. Okay, but it does. This points out. Look, the U.S. runs 30.5% of our government costs are military, and during the Cold War, it was up to 7% of our military costs were 7% of our government costs were in the military. So obviously, the U.S. has the capability of spending more money on its military, more money on reconstruction, the Marshall Plan for the Middle East or something like that. The U.S. has the possibility of mobilizing ideologies and people en masse, millions, hundreds of millions in a single direction. The U.S. is still the second largest industrial producer on the planet. The U.S. is still very large and powerful. But what could stop us, right? It's not other countries. If the U.S. and the EU work together, and the U.S. works militarily with South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines and so on, then in Australia, it's not really in danger of a swift overthrow. No one is attacking the U.S. and beating it in a couple of days. No one's invading it a la Iraq and overthrowing the entire government from A to B without a long, protracted issue. No economic issue is going to break the U.S. in half in the span of 5 years. It's going to take decades. So the U.S. sees all the troubles coming. The EU sees all the troubles coming. China sees all the troubles coming. India and Pakistan and Australia and Colombia and Mexico have quite a good idea, or at least some parts of their government do, have quite a good idea of what the issues of the future are going to be, what they have to solve. And there is a long history of cooperation, international cooperation. So none of these are insurmountable. No economic issue. I mean, COVID did not break the world in half, even though we isolated ourselves. The 2008 financial crisis caused all sorts of problems, but it did not lead to the Great Depression over the entire planet. Why? International cooperation. And yet, we always had the feeling it could fall apart. And what this book is trying to point out, I think, is it's not someone else attacking the state of the world. It is a slow, long degradation. It is a repeated failures year after year after year. It is an unwillingness to commit. It is a half-heartedness. And most importantly, right, it is not then the cost of regime change and nation building that threatens the American empire with overstretch. It is expenditure much closer to home. For the American economy has come to rely on a greater extent than any time in its history on consumption and credit, both public and private. America is a guns and butter enterprise. Okay. And it points something out here kind of interesting. Some would, of course, close the circle by saying that Hummers are needed in Iraq in order to keep Hummers in California supplied with cheap gasoline. But this once again exaggerates the importance of oil in the decision for war against Saddam Hussein. For the paradox of the empire of guns and butter can also be illustrated by comparing the contrasting economic fortunes of two American companies since the election of President Bush. Anyone who invested in the oil field engineering company in Halliburton in late 2000 would be disappointed. In the 3 years to November 2003, the company's shares declined by more than a third and did not benefit significantly from the more aggressive Middle Eastern policy supported by its friends in high places. An investor who put its money in Wall Street shares in late 2000 would, by contrast, have made a capital gain of a fifth. From a strictly economic point of view, investment in the quintessential consumer sector company has proved much more profitable than investment in the firm supposedly at the heart of the military petroleum complex. Basically, what this is saying is, yes, oil is important. Oil keeps the world economy going and flowing, but oil is not the be-all, end-all. Oil is just a mechanism for making money. And it turns out Americans are very interested in making money, right? Yeah, the oil is sort of the bedrock. It's what you need, but it's not an engine for growth, is what he's saying. Like, you don't make enough money from oil to change the world. Rising gasoline prices cause problems and disrupt the economy. But if we get rid of all the gasoline from Iraq tomorrow, well, then Saudi Arabia can increase its production. The U.S. can increase its production. Mexico can increase production. The price goes up, but then more people produce, and voila. You look at the shale oil revolution in the U.S. has changed our reserves substantially. And yeah, I think it's quite clear that oil has something to do with our investment and our interference in the Middle East. But we don't interfere in order to make money from oil so much as we interfere to make sure that the oil continues to flow. That is, why did Desert Storm happen? It wasn't because Desert Storm made us a ton of money. It wasn't because the oil companies called upon the United States to rescue them. It was because every car, every power station, every ship in the planet needs oil to run. And by attacking Kuwait, Saddam Hussein threatened the supply of oil to the planet. Said now the Middle East is going to be a conflict zone. So the U.S. does not want the Middle East to be a conflict zone. The U.S. wants to cause peace. And if it can't have peace, then it wants control. But if there is peace, a la Iraq to an extent, and the U.S. leaves or is prepared to leave, or at the very least, you can push the U.S. out. The Shah of Iran was put into place by a U.S. coup, and it was overthrown, and the U.S. didn't invade Iran. Because it was a problem, an issue, but it wasn't an existential one. So what are the existential issues for the United States? I would say it is security guarantees with East Asia and Western Europe, protection of the seas, essentially. I would also say it is peace with Mexico and Canada, protection from the land borders. And the third bit I would say is the economy. When have we seen the greatest disruptions in American life? They're economic disruptions. The revolution caused by British taxes. The Civil War caused by slaves seen as money. The whole westward expansion, the great manifest destiny, means of making money and owning land. Why does California exist, really, as a huge major area? Gold mining. The San Francisco Bay, the Bay of Los Angeles. Hollywood exists because Americans wanted to make money and had to get out of the East because of the political problems there. And Hawaii was a shipping point, but tons of people made money there by planting sugar. And so on and so on and so on. The Great Depression caused massive issues. 2008 disruption caused massive issues. And today, for all the cultural back and forth we get about like transgenderism or abortion rights, they are something we've dealt with before. They're not going to destroy the nation, but enough economic problems could. Another Great Depression could lead to another Roosevelt, or it could lead to a coup somewhere, right? It's like what does the military become in charge? Not when the government's running nice and well. It happens when there's massive economic disruption. And we don't think the military is going to overthrow the United States, but we have our own internal issues, obviously. It's going to be, I think, cultural issues, which are masking economic issues that are the real American problem. It's going to be our gigantic deficit. It's going to be income disparity. It's going to be transitioning to a green economy and the winners and losers of that. China can if China invaded Taiwan today and defeated the United States in a war, it would cause a sea change in the power structure of the planet. It would not destroy the United States. If Iran gets nukes, it would cause a sea change in the way the Middle East is organized. It would not destroy the United States. If South America erupts in a frenzy of drug-fueled violence, it would cause great damage. It would not destroy the United States. The only thing that can destroy the United States as a politics, as a polity, as a government, as an organization, is the weaknesses of the people of the United States themselves. Is the blindness or the ignorance or the self-righteousness and the unwillingness to negotiate and talk, right? The U.S. is good at going in at places and blowing them up. And why does it do that? When it can't talk. And if the U.S. can't talk with itself, then it's going to blow itself up. And yet we can't leave. We can't send in the Marines to Chicago and then exit and hope that Chicago reorganizes itself. We're on home ground. Right. Then it's going to talk about the shortfall and so on and so on. Another way of expressing the problem is to compare our own lifetime tax burden with a lifetime tax burden the next generation will have to shoulder if the government does not do one of the above. Hence the term often used to describe calculations like these, generational accounting. What such accounts imply is that anyone who had the bad luck to be born in America today, as opposed to in the 1940s or 50s, is going to be saddled throughout his working life with very high tax rates, potentially twice as high as those of his parents or grandparents. Notwithstanding the Bush administration's tax cuts, Americans today are scarcely undertaxed. So the idea of taxing the next generation at twice the current rate seems, to say the least, fanciful. There is, however, one serious problem with these figures, not with the calculations that underlie them, but with their acceptance. To put it bluntly, this news is so bad that scarcely anyone believes it. Nobody can be surprised that in the American political system, such unpleasant fiscal arithmetic gets marginalized. No sane presidential candidate would campaign with the slogan, hike taxes by 2/3. Nor is any rational incumbent likely to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits by more than half. It is therefore safe to assume that in the short run, almost nothing will be done to address the problem of generational imbalance. Unfortunately, this means the problem will still get worse. Yep. It got worse. And like, we're waiting for the hammer to fall. We're waiting for the government to default on its debts. We're waiting for Social Security and Medicare to get cut in half. We're waiting for the underinvestment in American naval construction to come back to bite us one day. We've been able to go on quite well, amazingly well, but that doesn't mean it'll happen forever. And then we get to the other book, taxes in the 21st century and what changes that may bring and so on and so on. But, it's part of the question. The American empire has been so successful. The American hegemony has been so successful that America is rich and powerful. And yet there are tens of millions of people in the United States who do not feel rich and powerful and blessed. I remember I went through South Phoenix one day on a bus, and I saw tin shacks. Just straight up tin shacks, no AC, people hanging their clothes out on a fence that was made of scrap wood. I've wandered through bits of South Sacramento and South Chicago. I've wandered through areas in Seattle in 3, 4 in the morning and seen a dozen homeless people sleeping in one of the parks. I've walked through Oakland and San Francisco. I've seen DC. There are great, powerful, wonderful people. and also poor folk who are just barely making it. Right? It's like you stay at a hotel, right? I used to work at a hotel, and same hotel, right? You would have people who are very well off. They come in with a Tesla or something, a brand new Tesla or something, and they want to stay the night, and maybe they're there for a business opportunity, or they're there to see a daughter's graduation, or their brother is involved in a competition of some sort, or you get some guy who's been a businessman since the 70s and has a emotional attachment to your brand, so that's what he always stays at this motel, even though he could obviously afford much better. And at the same time, you see just regular working folk, truck drivers, that sort of thing. And you also see folk who are just barely making it. I've seen people who, they come in and they hand me a fistful of ones, or they come in really late. Like, well, I got my tips from working at Denny's and I can afford a room tonight. And you've seen the folk who are old and elderly, and they're like, well, I can afford a room for 2 weeks on my Social Security and whatnot. And the people who are waiting to receive some help, or receive a subsidized apartment, or receive a settlement, and the ones who are homeless, and it's like 4 people who are homeless and they've just gotten their funds together to get one night in a room where they can take a shower. And it's just interesting, right? But interesting in sort of a sad way to walk along the streets of a city, and on your right, you see the Capitol, shining and white and Roman columns and people walking by in suits. And then you look left at the same corner, right is my Capitol. Look left, and I can see just down the street a homeless encampment with trash and a leftover stroller and a couple of bags, a shopping cart, a few tents, and the sense of the discrepancy from standing on one corner of one street in the United States. I've gone to places and I've heard people tell me that they want to move to the United States. They're trying to get a visa, that they think the United States is the shining city, that they think it's wonderful, that they'd be safe there, or they could grow a business there, or they know they go and I once talked to a guy who's like, oh, every year, me and my mates, we get together and do a motorcycle ride across the United States. And I know people who are, they're proud to be American, and they have the flag, and they salute the troops, and they work hard, and they help people, and they're trying to improve their lives, and they become rich, and they start businesses, and they work hard, and they raise families. And I've also seen the other side of drugs and gangs, of middle schools where the children fight the teachers, of a changing political system that is alternately full of liars and fools. We wonder, especially as Americans, what is the future going to be like, and what is the future going to be like? And it's unclear, right? We're not quite as hopeful as we used to be. We're not quite as hopeful as our elders. I've talked to my grandparents and my parents, and they're like, I'm glad I won't be here to see it. I'm like, yeah, great. You won't be here to see the next financial crisis, or you won't be here to see when all these folk from a marginalized community finally realize how angry they are. Right? Yeah, but I will be. I'll be here, and I'm going to deal with it. The price of American empire is, to a great extent, the happiness of the American people. And it will weigh more heavily upon some of us, and upon some of us during certain times than others. What happens in a world where the American empire is not a world hegemony, but only a localized one? Right? We look at the French. Bourbon France, like America today, had pretensions to imperial grandeur, but was ultimately wrecked by overstretch. It was not their overseas adventures that did for the Bourbons. Indeed, Louis XVI's last foreign war in support of the rebellious American colonies was a huge strategic success. The French overstretch was internal, and in its very heart was a black hole of implicit liabilities. In the same way, the decline and fall of America's undeclared empire may be due not to terrorists at the gates or to the rogue regimes that sponsored them, but to a fiscal crisis of the welfare state at home. Yet the extent of the fiscal problems of the U.S. and the timing of their manifestation cannot be discussed with reference to American expectations alone. This is a world of globalized capital flows, and no American foreign policy initiative can be divorced from one crucial fact, that this is a debtor empire. America owes a lot of people money. A lot of people owe America money. The world economy is linked together. The dollar is a reserve currency. China sends a huge number of its exports to the US or the EU. The US sells a whole huge number of its exports to China. And here they say something very interesting. Remember, book written in 2004. Given that domestic political gridlock will surely lead to a stream of deficits in the coming decades, a great deal depends on whether or not foreign investors will be willing to absorb increasing quantities of U.S. treasuries. So that's why we got into the world we are today. Right? Political gridlock, got that. Stream of deficits in the coming decades, definitely got that. Okay? Will foreign investors be willing to absorb increasing quantities of U.S. treasuries? We got that. People still buy U.S. government debt. That's why the U.S. has been able to run its deficit empire for so long. U.S. treasuries are very, very popular. People keep buying debt the U.S. puts out. Eventually, though, this won't work. It's pure mathematics, pure economics. There will be a trouble. There will be a problem. And the U.S. be so in debt that this minor issue destroys the economy. And the U.S. will have to respond with either a complete dismantlement of the welfare state, which will cause massive social issues, pushing us right back into the 1920s, or the U.S. will have to raise taxes very, very high, which will, having done that very suddenly, absolutely devastate the economy. Or the U.S. will print a bunch of money and inflate its way out of the debt problem, which will then destroy not necessarily the internal economy of the United States, but will destroy the exports of the United States. It will destroy the debt-gathering abilities of the United States, which means that the United States won't be able to borrow a whole lot of money very easily from then on. So it's just a question of which of those will happen. And the world economy being linked together, and the US being the reserve currency, this can have effects that ripple beyond the shores of America. This has happened before, right? The Great Depression, for example. In the 1980s, the US dollar fell. You have the surpluses between the United States and China. Low long-term interest rates are the key to the postponement of America's fiscal reckoning. So long as debt can be financed abroad at rates of little more than 4%, there will be no incentive to grasp the political nettles that surround Medicare and Social Security. The price of these low rates, however, is that the United States cannot expect to devalue the dollar. It must live with a static or even rising real exchange rate because its trading partners in Asia are buying dollar-denominated securities precisely to maintain nominal exchange rates as they are. The world sounds as if it has arrived at a more or less happy state of equilibrium. In history, however, no equilibrium goes unpunctuated. In the decade before 1914, it seemed to many observers as if economic interdependence between Britain and Germany were making a war between the two empires unlikely, if not impossible. Still, war came. In the months after the Wall Street stock bubble burst in October 1929, it seemed as if the United States would experience nothing more than a conventional recession. The Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, enacted in 1930, triggered a global depression. None of us can know what will trigger a shift from last year's equilibrium to something quite different. So the message of this chapter, chapter 8, Closing Door, is basically the U.S. is still a superpower, is still a hegemony, but is becoming a more unstable superpower, more unstable hegemony, because it does not have a counterbalance to it. And so the world is going to face a difference. Are we going to end up rallying around the United States and its vision of what the world should be? Will the United States even know what its own vision of the world will be, should be? Or will the United States get confused and go back and forth and half-ass everything it does and go in starting fights but not stay, and then stay but support a dictator? And what is are we going to experience massive political internal issues, focusing all our energy on our own problems? Will other people rise? Is the world going to become multipolar? Is it going to be the EU, China, and the US sort of pushing and pulling against each other? Are the US and EU going to join together on military issues but drift farther apart on economic issues? What happens to Japan and South Korea? Japan has run massive debts itself. South Korea has a shrinking population. Are we going to see China rise as a counterweight on a global scale, or will China be a counterweight only on a local scale? And we enter an area of multipolar empires. Or, perhaps worst of all, China could have its growing population and its old population and its weak internal consumption and its over-focus on production, and get locked out of the EU and US markets and experience a financial crisis or experience a political crisis. It could invade Taiwan and fail, threatening the stability of the Communist Party. The US could act isolationist. It could fall back into itself. It could have to pay its massive debts. It could destroy its own economy. The EU could do the same thing, massive debts, destroy its own economy, work together with China or against China. The EU could dissolve. You could have Brexit everywhere. Perhaps there is no world reserve currency. Perhaps there is no empire. Africa is primed for a continent-wide war. You have Venezuela threatening the countries around it. What happens if we enter a world where there is no unipolar power, there is no multipolar power, it's just sort of everybody sucking all at once? What if Pakistan and India nuke each other? What if Iran and Israel nuke each other and the whole Middle East just turns into a bloodbath full of refugees and terror? What if Africa is unable to feed itself? What if the nation of South Africa suffers so badly from corruption that its economy actually shrinks? What happens if Rwanda takes over half of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and spends the next 20 years pacifying the population? What happens if the drug lords of South and Central America join together, decide they want to make their own state? What if Mexico has yet another, federales killing kids in buses situation? Problems could that cause? What if the U.S. economy it blows up and the Canadian economy blows up in turn? What if Russia invades Estonia and NATO doesn't respond? We don't know what could happen. We don't know what the world is like. But we do know what the world is like 20 years after this book is written. And at least some of the points it makes are still present. Okay. So it points out a few things here. One. Okay. This is in the conclusion, only when the United States could cast itself in an anti-imperialist role against the British Empire in the Second World War and against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, were Americans able to perform their own crypto-imperial role with self-confidence. The United States has occupied and invaded many countries over the past 2 centuries. Yet in terms of economic and political institutions, relatively few of these have evolved into anything remotely resembling miniature Americas. Will things go any better in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq? What's going to happen to Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Libya, Syria, Burma, Zimbabwe? After all the bravado of the 3-week war, the Bush administration felt constrained to request assistance from the United Nations for its coalition provisional authority. To have any hope of securing this, the United States had to promise to expedite the transfer of power from the Anglo-American coalition to an elected Iraqi government. Still hasn't dealt with the Palestinian-Israeli problem, or even pretended to do anything about it. The United States hesitated to send forces to Liberia, and they left. In August, 3 ships carrying 4,500 Marines and sailors were sent to Liberia after repeated requests for American intervention. 225 U.S. personnel went ashore, 50 succumbed to malaria. 2 months later, the Americans were gone. This half-hearted African adventure seemed to exemplify the limits of American power, but how are we to explain these limits? As we have seen by most conventional measures of power, economic, military, and cultural, there has never been an empire mightier than the United States today. Its recent difficulties in achieving its foreign policy goals cannot simply be blamed on the Bush administration's alleged diplomatic ineptitude. Rather, we need fundamentally to rethink what we mean by power. And it talks about the Terminator here. The election of the actor Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor of California, the Governator, in October last year offered an important clue to the nature of American power. In his most recent film, Terminator 3, Schwarzenegger plays a muscle-bound and almost indestructible robot, programmed to protect a young man who is destined to save the world. In 3 distinct ways, the Terminator is a perfect, if unwitting, metaphor of American power. Though he has the body of a man half his age, Schwarzenegger himself is in fact just 4 years short of his 60th birthday. His determination to remain forever Mr. Universe typifies the determination of an entire generation never to grow old, though grow old they must with significant economic consequences. The Terminator is also a very American hero for the simple reason there's only one of him. In this, he personifies the chronic manpower shortage that currently constrains American nation building. Above all, the Terminator exemplifies the limits of American power because the word abort starts flashing in his head before he has completed his mission. Outwardly, Arnold Schwarzenegger is without question a colossus. He is to the human frame what the United States is to the capitalist economy. Yet his character, of the Terminator, embodies the three key deficits that explain why America only looks immensely strong without actually being immensely strong. Now, the US is immensely strong. It's just that we're not quite as strong as we think we are, and we're also weaker than we think we are. Bit of a paradox, right? The United States is militarily stronger than we think the United States is. But it is stronger because of its alliances, because of its bases, because of its agreements and its allies. The United States is economically stronger than we think, but it is so because of the freedom of the seas, because the dollar is a reserve currency, because the US will defend its economic interests, because the US and the EU worked together in capitalism for so long, because the US is far away from Eurasian problems half the time. The US is richer than we think, but we're also so poor that we run a deficit as a nation. All right? And is every strength of the American empire is because of the relationship the United States has with those nations outside its borders. If we reduce those relationships, then the United States' power will shrink far more than we think. Because we won't have those links to express our military power. We won't have the institutional knowledge to put sanctions on entire countries. We won't have the agreements whereby we can put tariffs on half the planet and they barely respond. Every time we exercise our power, we weaken it because other countries begin to see that the United States is using them and not defending them. The U.S. is strongest even in its own head, when it's not going to invade but going to protect, when it is not going to control but going in order to set free. The United States is strongest when we have an ally that we are assisting, because when the United States acts alone by itself, then it understands itself as an empire, as an undemocratic force. And so the U.S., in order to be strong, needs to see itself, needs to feel that it is a democratic force, a force for good, a shining city on a hill. And that means that it has to either fight against a clear evil, it means it has to fight against someone who wants to destroy it. And this is one of the paradoxes of the modern age, right? China, even though it may be an enemy of the United States, does not want to destroy the United States. China, even though it is a counterweight in economic power, is indelibly linked with the United States on an economic level. Russia is another story, I think. Iran is a bit of another story, because the US is not really a threat to either of these regimes. Instead, it is their own internal issues that are the problem. Whereas the way China sees it, America could cause internal issues to arise because of the linkage. And America constrains its military protectiveness. You know, America is interfering in its local politics. That's the way China sees it. Whereas the rest of the world looks at Russia interfering in other people's local politics. You know, Iran is interfering in the local politics of the countries around it far more than those countries are interfering in Iran's internal politics. I'm not sure which it is for the United States. We interfere in the politics of other places all the time, and how much are those places interfering in our politics? It's not always clear. Now, he points out against these weaknesses, the U.S. is still a growing economy. The U.S. is still 300 million people in it. The U.S. has this giant prison population. The U.S. has a large number of immigrants who want to join it. The U.S. has a history of intaking immigrants and working with them. The U.S. has a navy that can send people all over the planet. The U.S. has the greatest universities in the world. The U.S. has alliances. The U.S. has connections. The U.S. has its influence. The U.S., even though it has its own political instabilities, does have institutional level connections that have gone back decades with countries. Of the three deficits, however, it is the third that may prove the most difficult to overcome, namely the attention deficit that seems to be inherent in the American political system. This is not intended as a term of abuse. The problem is systemic. It is the way the political process militates against far-sighted leadership. In the words of retired General Anthony Zinni, there is a fundamental question that goes beyond the military. It's what's our obligation to the world? We preach about values, democracy, human rights. We haven't convinced the American people to pony up. There's no leadership that steps up and says, this is the right thing to do. And my own words, when there is a leadership that does it, we think they're incompetent because they don't get results fast. We think that they're lying. We think that they are corrupt and peddling money and contracts to their friends. We think that they're going there for the oil and not for the people. We think that Bush Jr. invaded Iraq because Saddam tried to kill his daddy once. But it's much more complicated than that. Right? And it says here, it's not just that the first-term American presidents have only 2.5 years in office before the issue of securing re-election begins to loom. It's the fact that even sooner, midterm congressional elections can have the effect of emasculating their legislative problem. It's the fact that American politics operates on 3 tiers simultaneously, the national, the state, and the local. How could Californians be expected to pay full attention to the problems of nation-building in Baghdad in the summer of 2003, when a self-selected mob of amateur politicians was noisily bidding to recall their incumbent governor? It is the fact that the federal executive itself is anything but a homogeneous entity. Interdepartmental rivalries, of course, the norm in most human institutions in any size. But there were times in 2003 when the complete absence of coordination among the Defense Department, the State Department, and the Treasury, to say nothing of the Commerce Department, the Trade Representative, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the host of institutions now notionally concerned with Homeland Security, are called the worst polycracy of Wilhelmine Germany. The presidency is, of course, an elected rather than a hereditary office, but its recent incumbents have sometimes appeared to conduct business in the style of the last German Kaiser, allowing policy to be determined by interagency competition rather than forging a sense of collective responsibility. Small wonder that so many American interventions abroad have the spasmodic, undiplomatic quality of Wilhelm II's Weltpolitik. Imperial Germany, too, practiced what Michael Ignatieff has called imperialism in a hurry. It, too, was impatient for quick results. And this is good. Unlike the Kaiser's Germany, however, the United States disclaims any interest in acquiring new places in the sun. Its conquests are not merely temporary, they are not even regarded as conquests. The Victorian historian J.R. Seeley famously joked that the British had built their empire in a fit of absence of mind. Americans, however, have gone one better. Here, absent-mindedness has become full-blown myopia. Few people outside the United States today doubt the existence of an American empire. But Americans persist in frantically avoiding recognition of the imperialism they, in fact, exercise. If all this conjures up an image of America as a sedentary colossus, to put it bluntly, a kind of strategic couch potato, the image may be worth pondering. What if even the United States, ever more preoccupied with its own internal problems, becomes the strategic equivalent of an inert lump of old iron? Consider again the question of peacekeeping. It has become abundantly clear that the United States is not capable of effective peacekeeping in countries as far apart as Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq without some foreign assistance. Peacekeeping is not what American soldiers are trained to do, nor do they appear to have much appetite for it. It also seems reasonable to assume that the American electorate will not tolerate a prolonged exposure of U.S. troops to the unglamorous hazards of low-intensity conflict. Suicide bombers, snipers, rocket-propelled grenades fired at patrols and convoys. The dangers that great power cooperation could simply break down, not because of rivalry between the United States and the European Union, but because neither lacks the will to act beyond its own borders. The future, in short, might prove for a time to be polar, a world without even one dominant imperial power, the 9th century perhaps, but without the Abbasid Caliphate. The paradox of globalization is that as the world becomes more integrated, so power becomes more diffuse. And this brings us to the final respect in which the United States resembles Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator. In military conflicts, the United States has the capability to inflict amazing and appalling destruction, while sustaining only minimal damage to itself. There is no regime it could not terminate if it wanted to, including North Korea's. Such a war might leave North Korea in ruins, of course, but the American Terminator would emerge from the rubble more or less unscathed. What the Terminator is not programmed to do, however, is to rebuild. In his wake, he leaves only destruction. Right? But, he says, I believe the world needs an effective liberal empire, and the United States is the best candidate for the job. Economic globalization is working. But there are parts of the world where legal and political institutions are in a condition of such collapse or corruption that their inhabitants are effectively cut off from any hope of prosperity. And there are states that, through either weakness or malice, encourage terrorist organizations committed to wrecking a liberal world order. For that reason, economic globalization needs to be underwritten politically as it was a century ago. Americans should try to do a better job of policing an unruly world than their British predecessors. These are the words the Colossus for time needs to heed, even as it seems to stride the globe unrivaled. The question Americans must ask themselves is just how transient they wish their predominance to be. Though the barbarians have already knocked at the gates once spectacularly, imperial decline in this case seems more likely to come, as it came to Gibbon's Rome, from within. It just repeats the message I've talked about already, right? America is this great power. America is this empire, and yet the greatest problem we seem to have is that when we act in an imperial fashion, the people of the United States begin to lose faith in America. When we invade and we stay places and we try to peacekeep and we nation build and we attack and we destroy and we defend and we give money to places and we make alliances and we are everywhere at all times under current of the world, the policeman of the planet, then the story is fine. The idea is fine. The American population wants to think of themselves as that shining city on the hill. But sometimes it's the shine of gold, the shine of prosperity, and other times it's the shine of fire and burning. Sometimes it's a shine of a supernova, a star burning brightly for a few moments or a few days or a few years. Other times, it's the light of a light bulb, which needs a consistent and constant supply of electrical power to keep its light going through all the darkness and the dawns. When the United States thinks it is going to free someplace, it can act in great power and might. It can move its allies. It can shift the world to free Afghanistan or Iraq. But what inevitably happens is America gets all brought together, believes the story, and it turns out it's not a happily ever after story. It's just a tale that keeps going on and on and on. We always think we're at the end of history, but history doesn't stop. The world continues to change. Our actions have consequences which resound and rebound upon us 20 or 30 or 40 years later. Europe has yet to come to real terms with her colonial past. The colonies have yet to come to a true understanding of how much they can blame the state of their country on internal problems versus external problems versus history. The United States is quick to forget its own troubles and problems, quick to hand over power because we don't want it anymore, quick to regret its actions, quick to quit its efforts, quick to tear itself apart, to blame somebody else for our own failures, quick to think, what have you done for me recently? Quick to vote for someone who promises to solve all the problems very simply and easily and gives us basic answers. The United States is stronger than it thinks, but it's more vulnerable as well. So I might ask, if the United States is going to be the country that it wants itself to be, is going to be the state that keeps the seas open, that keeps the world economy from crashing like it did in 2008, even though it was the fault of it, it was also its own fault. The U.S. is going to be the nation that has 100 overseas bases and protects dozens of countries, that trains the cops, that advises on economic issues, that funds the UN, that gives money for the eradication of polio, that has the universities which create AI and quantum computing and cures for AIDS? Or is the United States going to just be another country, another empire that forces its will upon the planet and takes and takes and takes? Is the United States going to be a Europe that rips wealth from its colonies, only to ultimately destroy the base of its own worldwide strength? Or is the United States going to be the country that went to Japan and South Korea and Germany and helped to build them, helped to protect them, helped to strengthen them, created out of rubble trading partners, that we could all grow and become rich together? You know, I've said repeatedly, the United States wants people to stop fighting, and what is the United States going to do? If we stop fighting, what happens to us or to the world? And, you know, guns, missiles are not the only way to fight. It's the ideas, it's the stories, it's the heart, it's the consistent actions. When America believes in itself, America can do great things. When the United States loses faith in the ideas which put the country on the map, the ideas which, even flawed in their execution as they are, still shine, like democracy and free ownership and health and truth and justice, the American way. You know, we look at the Captain America movies, and it's really that one where he has to go against Hydra that's the most interesting bit, right? He has to destroy the shield apparatus. He has to get rid of the hovercrafts. He has to attack the corruption inside. And he does this by himself, by information, and also with the help of all those soldiers who saw what was happening and said, something is wrong here. There's a person I trust. There's an idea I believe in, and someone is screaming at me, yelling at me, telling me that I should do this, I should do this, I gotta do this. But there's another person who just asks me, who says, what do you believe in?